Hey everyone, it's Jana from The Last Stitch. In today's video I will talk about sewing machine mistakes because let's be honest, we all do them. But the good news is that, well, quite of them are very easy to avoid. So in this video I will go through some of the most common sewing machine mistakes, and I've definitely made exactly all of them myself. Now, the first mistake, I'm pretty sure we've all done it, especially if no one told us not to, or we skimmed reading the sewing manual, as a lot of us have a tendency of doing, right? Well, and that mistake is to not lift the presser foot before you thread the needle. Because why, you may ask? Well, it's because if you lift the presser foot, you release the tension disc, that is the slot where the needle thread is pulled through, and the tension disc, that is what regulates the tension. So if the tension disc aren't fully open when you pull down the needle thread, you'll run into the risk of having tension issues because it can't get properly situated in that slot between those discs. So before you thread the sewing machine, always lift the presser foot. And that is true regardless if it's a sewing machine, if it's a serger or a Coverstitch machine, it all applies. Lift the presser foot first, then thread the needle. And if you are a little bit unsure, you can definitely do a flossing motion, which is similar to what you do when you floss your teeth. So basically, you just pull the needle thread between the disc and you feel, yeah, it sits properly now. Try that if you have any tension issues before you do any other type of search for what kind of things that might be going on. On most regular sewing machines, you don't have to adjust the under thread tension. Usually it's just enough to either increase or decrease the needle tension if you're having tension issues, but you can also, and you should, regularly check the tension of the bobbin case, which is where you put the bobbin, the under thread case here, because there's a little screw on the bobbin right here, and over time when you sew and all the friction and the movement, that can cause the little screw to turn just a tiny little bit, either increasing the underthread tension or decreasing. You have to check that because otherwise you will get wonky tension, and that's not intuitive because it's not as clear as the needle tension. And of course, if you have your sewing machine serviced by a professional, they will check this, but you can also do it yourself. And there's a good rule of thumb here, is that if you hold the bobbin case like this and then you pull the bobbin thread like this, when you hold it up like that, it shouldn't fall down, it should stay put. Because it falls down, that means the tension is too loose and you need to tighten the screw slightly. And then we're going to do this little yo-yo trick. So you do it like this. See? Did you notice that the bobbin case fell down a couple of centimeters? Then we're going to do it again. Boom, boom, like this. This means that the tension is pretty good. Now, if I had done the yo-yo trick and nothing happened with the bobbin, just stayed at the same place, that means that the tension is too high because there's no room for the thread to move through. So regularly check this. It's an easy fix, you can definitely do it yourself. Now you have to be very, very careful here because just a few millimeters is usually enough. You don't have to screw, or you have to, adjust the screw like a halfway or something like that. Just a few millimeters back or forth and you will be able to fix this issue. So if you haven't done that, go to your sewing machine and check the bobbin tension. And speaking of bobbin and bobbin thread, when was the last time you lift the stitch plate, the one underneath the needle, and checked out what it looks underneath? Well, I did that recently, and it was definitely time for a cleaning, a spring cleaning. So you're not the only one that don't do this regularly, because that is a gathering place for dust and lint and thread strands and Once that starts to build up, you will likely have several different sewing issues. You might have tension issues, you might have problems with the feed dogs, these tiny things that can alter the look and the feel of the stitching. So yeah, clean the bobbin, and it's very easy. You only have to remove, of course, first your presser foot and your needle. Then you lift the plate, and of course check your manual. It shows how to do that. It can be a little bit different. Mine is a little bit flip and flop like that on the Bernina. And then with just a small brush, it's usually included in your sewing machine kit, you can remove the lint. And sometimes also it could be good to use a pair of tweezers to pull up threads and stuff like that that might get stuck inside here with the feed dog. So yeah, do a little bit of spring cleaning or fall cleaning whenever you watch this video. It's an easy fix, and it's so satisfying to clean your sewing machine. And you can also, of course, if your machine manual recommends it, also add a little bit of oil in the bobbin area to make your sewing machine work even better. Another mistake that is quite common and that's very easy to make, I do it myself all the time, is that you don't have enough fabric underneath the presser foot, because the feed dogs, they need surface to work with. So for instance, if you're sewing, say like a lightweight silk fabric or rayon fabric, and then you start sewing, so you only have the edge just a little bit in behind the needle like that, you run a big risk of the feed dogs kind of like pulling the fabric towards the inside of the sewing machine, towards the bobbin, and you will risk ruin the fabric, or at least have some type of feeding issue. And there's a reason for that, and the reason for that is that, as I said, the presser foot and the feed dogs, they need to have contact, even contact, because that will help with feeding. Now, of course, there are situations that you will not be able to achieve this due to the specifics of the things that you are sewing. For instance, if you're doing top stitching a corner on a collar, for instance, that corner between the fabric and the feed dog, so there's going to be a lot of empty space, and might cause problems with the feeding. And what you do that is that you, next to your actual garment piece that you're sewing, you insert a piece of fabric, the same amount of layers underneath, and that can help the feeding work much smoother. It's the same thing, for instance, if you are hemming on the flat. For instance, if you're doing cover stitching on knit fabrics before you actually sew the sleeve together, for instance, the same principle applies, is that it's going to be a little bit hard for the machine to sew properly. So I always start with a piece of fabric scrap that I put behind, because that gives it even surface so it can work smoothly, and then I just cut away that remains. It's no worries. That's how a lot of us have to solve this problem. So it's not the machine that is broken, and it's not you either. It's just that the presser foot and feed dogs, they want to keep in good contact and leveled. And now a little bit more about tension, and that is to not get the tension right, because there is a sweet spot, something that we refer to as balanced tension. And even if your sewing machine like my Bernina has an auto tension function, there are lots of instances, depending on what type of thread you're using, what type of fabric you're using, how thick the fabric is, that will require you to adjust the needle tension. So what is balanced tension? I guess we should start with that. Well, take a look at this sample. Here you can see balanced tension, and the telltale is that you cannot see any of the underthread popping through on the right side of the fabric. The underthread is red here, and if we look on the inside, you cannot see any of the yellow needle thread on the reverse side, and that means the tension is balanced. So only needle thread on the outer side and only bobbin thread on the inside. What happens if the needle tension is too low? What you can see here is that it will form big loops around the underthreads. You can see here those yellow uneven loops. They are signs that the needle thread tension is too loose. And this is a very common thing. Usually the error is something in the threading, so you should definitely start by checking the threading. For instance, when I said remember to release the presser foot up before you do any threading, and also make sure that you follow all the thread guides and check your manual to make sure that it's all done correctly. And if you have done all these things, then it's time to increase the needle tension, do that in increments to figure out what is the perfect setting for your specific project. Now, not as common, but it can definitely happen, is that the needle tension is too high, and that will cause the underthread or the bobbin thread to show through on the right side. So if we look closely at this sample, you can see that there are red dots on the right side of the fabric. That means that the needle tension is too high, so it pulls up the underthread. And luckily, this is again a super easy fix. Just lower the needle tension until you get balanced stitching. And speaking of doing samples, in general, a common sewing machine mistake is to not doing samples before you start sewing a new garment, because every project is unique. So even though you have your preferred settings, depending on what type of fabric you're using, the size of the needle, the stitch length, the stitch width, all these things will affect the end result. So apart from tension issues, which I mentioned previously, another thing that is good to figure out before you start sewing is the right stitch length. Now, for instance, when you're sewing straight stitch, you can change between different lengths, maybe 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters, sometimes up to 5. Now, just because you use a 3 millimeters length, it doesn't mean that it will be exactly 3 millimeters long on every project. Because, for instance, if you're doing 3 millimeters on a very lightweight fabric, say a lightweight rayon crepe or a silk fabric, those stitches are going to look way longer than if you use 3 millimeters to top stitch these seams on a pair of jeans, because fabric eats thread, right? It makes sense, because you can like think of it as kind of swallow some of the thread length. So 3 millimeters will look shorter on heavy layers of fabrics compared to a thin layer of fabric. So that's why it's so important to check this first. So always do a sample, just take a few minutes, and it's going to save you so much time and really improve the end result of your sewing. Now, the threads getting jammed either inside the stitching or getting pulled down inside the plate is also a common problem. Now, an easy way to avoid this is of course to keep that area clean, like I mentioned previously. But another easy thing is to just remember to pull back the strands of the needle and bobbin thread before you start sewing. So just pull them back, make sure that they are way down and they're not too short, and that will usually fix this issue. I mean, it sounds so rudimentary, but sometimes when we're sewing, we seem to forget those very basic practical things that we should always remember. And I do this myself and I always regret that. So just pull them back and you're good to go. And my final thing that I've noticed myself doing, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, is that sometimes I have not properly attached the needle in the slot, because you have to pull the needle up, all the way up in the slot, in the sewing machine needle I'm talking about here. You have to pull all the way up first of all to make sure that it's exactly at the right length, and then you have to screw tight to make sure that the needle stays put, because I have had this happen many times. I'm the first to admit that I didn't screw the needle enough, and then when I sewed, usually in a thicker project, for instance when I'm sewing a pair of jeans, then the needle gets sucked down, and it gets sucked down from the slot and into the fabric, because it's such a silly mistake to do. At least I get a little bit upset with myself, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had this happen. And again, it seems like a no-brainer, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done this mistake. So definitely check that the needle sits where it should be, before you start sewing, and screw tightly and you're good to go. So these were some common sewing machine mistakes. If you want to learn more about sewing, you can also check out some of the videos that I've linked to in the description section of this video. I've also done a blog post on this topic as well if you want to learn more about how to avoid sewing mistakes. And if you have made anyone, don't be shy, please share in the comment section, and so we can learn from each other. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Johanna Lundström. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.